Hello and welcome to another episode of the Project Purple podcast. I'm Dino Verley, founder and CEO of Project Purple, and today I'm back in the podcast studio, and I've got a special guest with us today coming to us all the way, not that far for us here in Connecticut, but maybe for our listeners out on the West Coast, but all the way from Ottawa, Canada, Dr. David Stewart, medical oncologist at the University of Ottawa. And before I hand this over to David, I just want to give some background. David trained in medical oncology in the Department of Developmental Therapeutics at MD Anderson in Houston, Texas from 76 to 78. He was on staff at MD Anderson from 78 to 80, and then in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada from 80 to 2003. He then moved back to MD Anderson. He probably missed the warm weather and the Tex-Mex down there. Returned again to MD Anderson in 2003, but then returned back to the University of Ottawa in 2011 as the professor of medicine and head of Division of Medical Oncology. Since completing his term as the division head in 2019, he has continued to teach and practice oncology in Ottawa. Thank you for joining us here on the Project Purple podcast, Dr. Stewart.
Well, thank you for having me. It's very much appreciated.
That's a pretty extensive background. And I know we were talking offline before. I was asking you what you prefer, the heat or the cold. And you said the cold. You'd rather shovel snow than deal with the hurricanes in Houston.
Yep, that's right. It all depends what you get used to. And I grew up just south of Ottawa. And as I was telling you, Ottawa is the coldest capital city in the world. But the trick there is just get out and enjoy it. And it's fantastic when you do.
I don't think you could said that any better. I know friends that live up by the Canadian border in Minnesota, north of Duluth, and you either got to embrace the winter or you got to get out. So I think you summed that up perfectly. Well, thank you for joining us on the podcast. And I know you've got a very interesting, I say this a lot. There's a lot of these terms that I say that you'll hear me. If you haven't listened to the podcast, I know our listeners probably hear this. Full disclosure here. We connected via email. You had sent an email about your book. I think maybe we got a Google hit, quite honestly, but I am interested in having this conversation. You have a book intended, and I know you'll talk about this, for patients, entitled A Short Primer on Why Cancer Still Sucks, which is available on your website and also on Amazon. This was published in April 2022, so just a couple months back. But you've been at this for a long, long time. And I'm excited to have you on this because this thing called cancer is, and I know we focus a lot here on pancreatic cancer, but pancreatic cancer falls under cancer. And I've always said, and I know you and I talked about this before we hit record, is there's so much that we can learn. So I love having specialists from all different types of cancers on our podcast, because I think we are still in this infancy of pancreatic cancer and learning about the disease. And if there's another cancer that's doing something better, we should learn from that, maybe try to see if we can implement that. And I think the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, right? And I feel sometimes in this cancer world, I've been at this for 12 years now with pancreatic cancer, Dr. Stewart, and recently there's a couple of families that I've been very attached to, that I've gotten to know through the foundation. But it's the same kind of hamster wheel that these families are on, that I went through that same hamster wheel 12 years ago with my dad, in terms of the treatments and why are we still, doing the same things we did 12 years ago. So when I saw the email come across, I was like, oh, this is a great topic. And I think timing for me personally, for what I'm going through, my experience, I'm really excited to have you on. So with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to you to share your background and get into what we're going to talk about today. And as I said before we hit record, you can go as far back as you want, or you could say as high level as you want. And with that, the mic is yours.
So I grew up just south of Ottawa and went to medical school in Kingston, Ontario, then down to MD Anderson Hospital to do my training, as you said. Loved it down there, but I like Ottawa better. So I came back up here to in 1980, and then went back down to MD Anderson for some research opportunities in 2003. Then back up here in 2011, and again, so I've experienced both the Canadian and American healthcare systems. And as I say in chapter 14 of the book, I love them both and I hate them both. They both have major pluses. They both have major disadvantages, and nobody's quite got it right yet as far as what's the best way to manage healthcare systems. But pros and cons to both of them. But love what I'm doing here, and just plan to keep on doing it for as long as I can. I wrote the book because of all the questions my patients keep on asking me about cancer, so that it was written to answer many of those questions, and also to address systems issues. So each chapter in the book, again called A Short Primer on Why Cancer Still Sucks, available through Amazon Books. Each chapter starts with a short primer section that's written in a way that anybody without a healthcare background can understand it, and then a further detail section that goes into quite a bit more detail with references. And most people without a medical background could still understand it, but a bit more technical. And the way I stayed honest to that is that the major people that proofread the book were my wife, who's an interior decorator, and my stepdaughter, who's an elementary school teacher. So they told me I was getting off track as far as being able to understand. Then we fixed that so that people could understand it. And I tried to cover the full spectrum of cancer. So why it's so common, and what we can do about that. What the pros and cons of screening, or the limitations of screening. How cancer causes symptoms. How it makes people feel so sick, different treatment options and their limitations and side effects, complementary and alternative therapies and why they're complementary and alternative rather than mainstream, oncology myths and legends, which is things that we think we know, but where we really get it wrong, and how that slows us down. Then in the systems, why it takes so long to develop new anti-cancer therapies and the price we pay for that, what's slowing us down, what we need to do to speed it up. And COVID has proven to us that we can speed things up if we put our mind to it, and we really need to in cancer. And also why the therapies are so expensive. And it's exactly the same things that slow down progress that also make the therapies more expensive, and what we need to do about that. And then I go into a comparison of the Canadian versus American healthcare systems, and what they both do well, what they both do not so well, and what both would have to do to make things better. And then the last chapter is on the future of cancer care, and just how things are changing very rapidly, and they're going to keep on changing rapidly. You mentioned about how we keep on doing the same things. In fact, that's true to a certain extent, except that we keep on leaping ahead in different areas as well. And the trick is that we'll keep on thrusting and parrying and trying to find out the right way to do things and hitting roadblocks. And then we'll find a weakness in the cancer that permits us to leap ahead in one area. And then we see whether that's relevant to other areas of cancer to try it there, and so that we can try to make advances there also. So one of the things with pancreatic cancer is that with so-called targeted therapies, so far they do not work most places. So it's not like adenocarcinoma of the lung, where suddenly we had major advances starting 20 years ago, and malignant melanoma, where we suddenly had major advances starting 20 years ago. And it's not like also immunotherapy, that again, that's been major advances in many areas of cancer, but not in pancreatic cancer. But we know it's just a matter of us keeping prodding. So that, for example, pancreatic cancer, about 76% of patients have something called a KRAS mutation. And there are many different variants of KRAS mutation. So that there's one that's common in lung cancer that is not common in pancreatic cancer, but we can now target it. But now we know at least we can target KRAS, so that people are trying all sorts of strategies now to try to be able to target the different versions of KRAS. And we know that could have a huge impact in pancreatic cancer once we hit that. And also, while the current immune checkpoint inhibitors that we're using in lung cancer and melanoma tend not to work well in pancreatic cancer, there are 13 different immune checkpoints, and so far we've only really targeted 2 of them, and a huge amount of effort out there to try to target the other ones. And it is a definite possibility that one of those could prove highly useful in pancreatic cancer. So right now it doesn't look good in pancreatic cancer, but we know that could change very rapidly, and it could just be one small advance in one area that looks completely unrelated, but in fact it ends up because of the backdoor effect of that advance that it could have huge implications. So I end the book actually with my favorite poem that is called "Say not the struggle not availeth." And the last verse of that poem says, "And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward look, the land is bright." Same thing. It may look like we're making very slow progress, but just what we're learning, and just one more bit of information that could suddenly transform that into a major leap forward. So that I think it's going to be a long time still before we're curing metastatic cancers. But I think that we've been getting better and better and better at controlling them, and at least offering quality of life and symptom improvement and prolongation of life expectancy with therapies, and that's going to keep on going. And I don't know whether our ability to cure them, whether that's going to come next year or 10 years from now, or whether it's going to take us 50 years. We won't know until we've done it. And we won't know until we've hit that final thing that we're able to actually convert major benefit in some cancers into cure. So again, I don't know whether that's going to be 1 year or 10 years or 50 years, but we just keep plugging along. Actually, I also point out in the book that my mentor, the late MLJ Freireich, the great cancer pioneer MLJ Freireich, he had Freireich's laws, and one of Freireich's laws was that the only people who come close to predicting the future are the science fiction writers, and they always under-predict rather than over-predicting. And at the time that he told us back in the 1970s, none of us thought we'd be walking around with phones in our pockets, whether we would no longer need a map because a computer in our car would be talking to a satellite. That was just science fiction. But if you can imagine it, then it may be possible to do it. So the important thing is to keep on imagining it and to keep on going after it, and we will make progress.
Wow. That was, so I've been taking notes, Dr. Stewart, and that was a lot. But I want to thank you first for sharing that. And I want to dissect some of these pieces that you just mentioned. And there's parts there that I could not agree with you more. And then there's parts here that I'd love to hear more. And so that's why I'm going to, my role here is I'm going to pull out things that I really think that are kind of trigger points that I'd love to talk kind of further with. Before we get there, I got to ask probably the obvious question here. Maybe our audience is either watching or listening, is probably thinking themselves, why write a book? And I phrase it this way. I always talk about this. There's like a tipping point. Was there a tipping point at one point? You know, you're in your career, you're doing this, you're seeing patients, you're doing research. I know you've got a lot of experience in research interest in, anti-cancer agents, pharmacology, new drug development, dysfunctional regulation, and clinical trial designs on the rate of clinical research projects. Progress and the huge cost of clinical research dysfunctions. So you've dove into all these topics throughout your career, but was there a tipping point, or was there something that said, all right, I want to write a book because I want to get this out there, want people to know? if you look back, and hindsight's always 2020, right? Like we can always kind of say like, oh, it's because of this or because of that. But was there something that happened that said one day, like, hey, I'm going to write this book? Or was this something that you always had in the back of your mind, that it was part of the plan as part of all this work that you've been doing over the years?
So that had been telling my wife for 20 years I was going to write a book for patients, and then just never quite got around to it. Then in early 2019, I took a 3-month sabbatical where I just sat up at a farm in the bush and worked on stuff like this. So I started writing the book then, so got started, and it was really there were two reasons for doing it. One is that all my patients, many of my patients tell me that the worst thing of all is uncertainty. The worst thing is not knowing. They tell me that uncertainty is worse than bad news. If they've got bad news, at least then they know what they do, what they have to do. They have to start dealing with it. Uncertainty, it's very, very difficult, very unsettling. And so they would tell me that the more they knew about it, the better. To not sugarcoat anything, not try to hide any details. If it's bad, let me know, and then let's figure out what we're going to try to do about that. So it was to educate patients as a part of what I want to do to try to help them. The other part of it is that I first started writing about issues with clinical research back about 12 years ago. So I wrote papers that were very well received, but then just didn't accomplish anything. Where all the things that we need to change about clinical research to make it possible to make much faster advances. And for example, there was one paper we wrote to more recently where we just calculated the number of life years lost, and one life year is one person being alive for that 1 year. The number of life years lost worldwide per year of delay in getting a new anti-cancer drug approved, and the number was staggering. 80,000 life years lost per year of delay in getting the drug approved, and because it takes an average of 12 years to take a drug from discovery to approval. It was about 1 million life years lost for each of the other drugs that we looked at in the time from discovery to approval, and that was staggering. But when I submitted that paper to different journals, the first 8 journals turned it down before the 9th one published it. And what the reviewers said were things like, "These numbers are so huge they cannot possibly be real," even though anybody could have access to exactly the same numbers I used and do exactly the same calculations. Other reviewers said, well, but the problems are too complicated. We can't fix them anyway, so it doesn't make any difference if we know this, and we can't fix this. And other reviewers said, but the drugs are so expensive that most people will not be able to access them anyway, so this doesn't make any difference. Who needs to know this? So that astonished me. And also, I published an op-ed in one of our newspapers up here on this, and absolutely no reaction. So I pointed out that the problem is, it's like what Stalin said. Joseph Stalin once said, "If one man dies, it's a tragedy. 1,000, it's statistics, and it's just statistics that everybody is numb to, and they don't see the reality of it until they're in the middle of it themselves, and then suddenly it becomes very real. But then they're isolated, and it becomes very difficult." And just COVID was a perfect illustration of the fact that we can't solve these problems, because in the past it would take 7 to 12 years to develop a vaccine, and the fastest one ever was the mumps vaccine at 4 years. Then COVID comes along, and because everybody decides it's important, it's solved within 1 year. And I don't think we'll ever be able to develop a new anti-cancer drug within 1 year because of the complexities. But I think we can do it within 3 to 4 years. I think we can do much better than what we're doing. And if we do that, then we save lives, we alleviate suffering. And also, because it's exactly the same thing that make things take too long, that drive up costs, then it becomes possible, it becomes feasible to start bringing down the massive costs of these new therapies as well.
So, 2 things came up as you mentioned those 2 items, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on here, but I think the one thing that I've seen here is that, patients not knowing, and there's so much uncertainty. It's almost like no one talks about death. No one talks about cancer, right? It's not like you go to a cocktail party. Actually, we're in the space, right? You and I are in the cancer space. So when we go out, people, oh, how's work? Well, they know like this is what we do, right? But the general public, let's say 95% of the general public out there in the world, they're not talking about cancer. I do think the one thing that has happened over the last maybe 10, 15 years is, this whole concept of, healthy diet or exercising. And not so much I think some of it now is starting now. I mean, there's, and I'm not making this stuff up, but there's data out there that says like, hey, if you smoke, like you're going to get cancer. If you drink, if you're obese, if you eat certain foods, the odds are stacked against you to get these chronic illnesses and cancers, right? So I think there is somewhat of a shift, but then again, people live their lives. They kind of do what they have to do. Everyone's busy. We're all busy, right? We've got all these distractions. And so, but my point here is I think no one really prepares for cancer. No one wants to talk about it because it's got this negative thing. So it's not, I mean, I guess, and I remember when I was in the insurance business, like Aflac had these like cancer policies, and I remember one time the Aflac guy coming in and saying, well, this would be a great, add-on to your life insurance clients because, life insurance pays when they die. This cancer policy pays if they get sick and have cancer. And, you pull on those strings. And then maybe that's when the conversation is talked about, right? But then it's gone, right? And then, if you're the general public, you're paying for this policy every month. And then if you get sick, you got it, right? So I think that's one thing, like, no one, it's such taboo, right? And there's such a negative connotation around all cancers that no one really talks about it. And then my second thing here, and just hearing you talk about like the papers and the data, and I love your analogy that you used, about, one person dying or, 1,000 people. I think like it's hard. I wrote down here system, and this is where, I don't know if the system has failed us, Dr. Stewart, in the sense that, we've been practicing, and this is kind of a bigger question, and maybe we dive into this later on as we go through these topics, but I don't know if the system is primed to help change this, or if the system is just what it is, and it's hard. And I'm not trying to point blame on a particular person, but maybe the system is just so big that it's really hard, and sometimes you need something, and this is my hope, like a pandemic, like you said, where we realize like, hey, this development of drugs can happen in a very short period of time if you get everyone in line, right? If you get government, pharma, the general public, on board all at the same time, then we can move mountains. But I don't know if for cancer, if there's enough push, if there's enough people. I mean, I guess we'd have to unify all the cancers, but to your point that your latter point where, I don't think we could have a vaccine for all cancers because all cancers are so complex and they're so different. And some things have worked really well. Like you said, immunology, right? Like there's some immunotherapy trials that work excellent in other cancers, but for some reason in pancreatic cancer, they just don't work. Like it just hasn't happened. So to say like there's the one size fits all pill or vaccine or shot that people can take that will cure cancers, all cancers, I don't know if the system is ready for that, or if the system is willing to accept that. But also then we have that complexity of all cancers being really, really unique in some way that I don't think that's a reality.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that the cancer is not one disease; it's 1,000 small diseases, and there are some commonalities and many differences. But general principles, if we find a general principle that works in one, then if we apply the same general principles, then that can potentially help us make advances. And it's not a smooth continuum that every day things just get a little bit better. As we go hitting a brick wall for a period of time, and then we jump, and then we at a higher level, and then we go for a period of time again, not to accomplish anything, and then we jump again, just by serendipity and just by individual new bits of knowledge that suddenly give us huge insight and help us really do things. Now, as far as the systems are concerned, you're absolutely right. It's not one person's problem. This is something that we all got into together. And my chapter 12, speed bumps in the Autobahn, I point out that there's 1,000 speed bumps that slow us down, and every one of those speed bumps is there for a reason. It was very much justified to put it there, but altogether they're slowing things down. People tell me, well, what's the one thing you'd fix to make things better? And I said, well, if you have a freeway with 1,000 speed bumps on it, if you take out one speed bump, that's not going to make any difference. You have to tackle the entire thing. And part of the problem is that there have been lots of problems with clinical research and drug development in the past, where mistakes were made, or there were misleading things, or patients were harmed. And these speed bumps, so the regulation is absolutely essential to keep things right. But when regulations were put in place to solve the problem that was identified, none of them took into consideration the impact they would have on slowing things down. And so it's like you have a freeway with lots of traffic accidents. And everybody's concerned about the number of people getting killed from traffic accidents. So what's the solution? Well, you make the speed limit 5 miles per hour, and bang, you've solved the problem. No more deaths from traffic accidents, but suddenly you've got other huge problems that you have to address. And so the analogy again I use is the Autobahn in Germany. I don't know whether you've ever driven on the Autobahn, but it's got large areas with unlimited speed limits, so you can drive as fast as you want to, and you might be out there driving 100 miles per hour, but somebody will pass you going 150 miles an hour in their big BMW or their big Mercedes, and yet it's got one of the lowest traffic fatality rates in Europe, and that's because they've got smart regulation, and that's what we need. We need to have a complete look at this and create smart regulation that permits rapid progress with, while at the same time protecting people. And that's what the whole push for the COVID vaccines did. Permitted rapid progress, but safely. And we have to make this a top priority for all lethal diseases. I have no problem at all if it takes years to develop a new treatment for acne or hemorrhoids or constipation. No problem at all if it takes years for that. But if you've got a lethal disease where you're looking down the gun barrel, then we need things to happen much, much, much faster. And you're absolutely right. The problem is that people don't understand until they're in the middle of it. They don't understand how bad things are, how much things are slowed down, or how difficult it can be to get access to a promising new drug, because the clinical trials, the exclusion criteria in the clinical trials mean that only 5% of people that with cancer in North America ever make it onto a clinical trial, because the rules are just unreasonably tight in how they're set up. So we need to tackle this. There's a cancer advocate whose name is Louise Binder, but years before she was a cancer advocate, she was an AIDS advocate, an AIDS activist, and she's pointed out that the big problem with cancer is cancer patients are just too damn polite, and points out that with AIDS, people were mad. There was an identifiable group that were disenfranchised, and they'd been picked on in the past, and so they felt very angry, and because they moved this forward as a group and managed to move things very, very rapidly. So whether it's moving it forward rapidly like that, or moving it forward rapidly as a population because we're concerned about AIDS, that just means that if we put our mind to it, we can do that. These are not unsolvable problems. But part of the reason for reading the book was that I wanted to get it out there to people, to everybody, that we do need to reach this tipping point where it becomes very important to move things through forward rapidly. And we have to make sure that we do not jeopardize safety or patient confidentiality or consent or anything like that in the process. We don't want to do that, but we know that we can change things to make it much faster, much cheaper, and at the same time that we're maintaining all these other things. And we just need to make this a priority. That's my point. We need to make it a priority so that if I'm talking to you 10 years from now about pancreatic cancer, there's still no major advances. I want those advances this year or next year, but we're going to have to really to change our approach to things to make this happen. And one of the problems is that many years ago they had international harmonization of the approach, so that if new data were generated in one country, they could be used to approve the data in another country. So that harmonization is great, except that the things that are holding research back in one country are holding it back worldwide, because this is a system that we've set up. So we need to set up the harmonization to permit rapid progress, and also you'll have individuals and groups that want to move things forward rapidly. But if the FDA, for example, tries to change things to make things faster, there are 10 other agencies, United States government agencies, that will put in another regulation that will slow it down, and so that we accidentally get in each other's way, and prevent each other from leapfrogging this and really getting ahead. So this is what we've got to recognize, and this is what we've really got to tackle. And I know that President Biden has that cancer is very, very important to him. So that type of high-level commitment is essential. But even with him, he has to understand this is not a funding issue. This is not a research funding issue. Yes, funding is important, but this is a systems issue in how we do it, and the things that make it cost so much, and the things that slow us down. Those are the things that must be tackled.
So that was a lot. I think the one thing I'll throw in here, and I do have two questions here. I remember I was fortunate to go to Washington, D.C., and we brought up the politics here, so we'll go down that rabbit hole real quick. Try to. I was able to go to D.C. in 2012, and we saw our state legislation. We saw a lot of legislators that day. It was like a marathon day, literally. And I remember one aide pulling me aside and said, "Hey, listen, if you're the loudest, most obnoxious group, you will get stuff done."
Yeah.
And from that day on, I've always said, like, hey, if we're gonna lobby, and we don't do any legislative lobbying here in the States. I honestly think it's a waste of time. The other thing that I realize, and this is why I think it's a waste of time, because our size, and also for where we focus, there's other groups that do that, which I think is awesome, because they have the bandwidth, they have the size, and they focus. They are entrenched. They are working with NIH and stuff like that. But that's not our mission here. But the other thing that I realized is that this aide said, well, tomorrow the firefighters are coming in. After you leave, it was like the fraternal brotherhood of the unions, like everyone's grabbing, right? DC here in the United States, DC is this ultimate grab of money, and it's whoever's the loudest and whoever has the strongest lobbying group that can get stuff done. And I think that's something that, again, we don't get involved in personally. I mean, I get involved in it a little bit personally because I know a lot of our state elected legislators. But it is tough, man. It is really, really tough. But I do think, to what you said, reading between the lines here, and I believe this, is that we've got to have, in order for us to create change and dramatic change, you have to have everyone working together. And that starts with the administration, the FDA, the NIH, the politicians, the pharmas, and then, the medical institutions, and then also philanthropy. If you have everyone aligned, great things can happen. But I do feel very strongly that, to your point there last, was there is some disconnect here, at least here in the United States. Like, we've got patients begging for clinical trials, and this is probably another rabbit hole that we won't go down, is like, do people really understand? I think here in the United States, people think clinical trials are miracles, and that's not necessarily the case, right? There's a process of clinical trials, and I've talked to many pharmaceutical companies about, helping get patients into clinical trials, and I feel like here in the United States, they do a very poor job, pharma, of explaining and educating patients about clinical trials. And I think if there was more education, I think more people would be open to getting into these clinical trials. And I think that's a part where we kind of fail here in the US. But then you have, the rigorous requirements of these clinical trials, or the timing of, new drugs to get to market, and how that process is established, and whether it's the FDA, the NIH, or, where those guidelines are placed, I think is really tricky. And again, if they're not all on the same page, I don't think things move as fast. And I think that's some of the barriers, as you've mentioned. You hit a wall, whether it's a clinical trial or research, and then you've got to wait for things to open up, and then you progress, hit a wall, progress, hit a wall. I know for patients listening, I mean that's a really tough thing to keep telling them to, hey, hang in there, stay in the game. I know you're beat up right now, but maybe in 6 months there'll be another enhancement or advancement in treatment, or potentially a new drug therapy that might be available. A lot of people don't have 6 months. Right? They probably don't have 3 months potentially. So it's frustrating, I know, from the patient advocate side to hear that, but unfortunately that's just the way the process is right now. I got 2 questions that I want to bring up, these 2 points, and I'm going to start at the top. I know, and this is probably, the first topic is in your book, the first topic that you bring up is, why is cancer so common? So and we don't want to give all this away, but maybe sum this up, Dr. Stewart, is why is cancer so common today in 2022, not just in Canada, but all over the world? I mean, we're seeing this kind of explode everywhere, not just in certain parts of the world.
So the number one factor driving cancer is just getting one day older. Just because in your body, you've got about 37 trillion cells, 100 billion of them divide every day, and there's an average of 3 mutations per cell division. So every one of us just living our normal life, that's 300 billion new mutations every day. Unfortunately, many of them are not of much consequence, so they can be repaired, or they lead to cell death, or what's called senescence, where the cell can no longer divide. It's damaged, can no longer divide, but it still can function. So just getting another day older is the number one driving factor. So I point out in the book that it's been darkly observed that the best way to avoid getting cancer is to die young with something else. But not a good strategy. So then anything that you do that increases the number of mutations will increase your risk of cancer. So that's where smoking comes in, drinking alcohol, high-fat diet, being overweight, inflammation, asbestos exposure, air pollution, all those things increase the number of mutations. So that increases the risk. And also, if you have more cells dividing, so again, being overweight, or being on different hormones, for example, that will drive increased cell division, then those things increase the risk of cancer. And some things actually appear to actively possibly reduce the risk of cancer. So that members of the lettuce and cabbage and broccoli and Brussels sprouts family, for example, eating lots of fresh fruits and vegetables may help reduce the risk of cancer. Exercise does. So lots of things that can reduce the risk of it, but nothing's perfect. Actually, being pointed out that I mentioned about cells becoming damaged and becoming senescent, so that permits them to still survive and to support life, but they can no longer divide. It's been pointed out that the process of aging is actually a protection against cancer. So me looking old and gray and flabby is because of all these cells have become senescent. They're still supporting my life, but it can no longer divide because they're damaged, so they cannot develop into a cancer cell. That's the important thing. So one of the things that it's impossible to avoid everything that could increase your risk, and the important thing is to just use some just not to do too much of it. So as my wife kept pointing out to me, it's important that we all live our lives and enjoy them, not lock ourselves in some room where we're protected from everything. Then life's no fun. But how can we minimize the risk while still having a very full, enjoyable life? So you drink 1 glass of wine a week instead of a bottle a day, or you only have steak once or twice a month rather than eating it every night. Those types of things that you just use some control in limiting exposure, because then if you limit exposure, that reduces your risk.
So I remember reading something couple years back that said by the time you reach, I think it was like, and this was based on US statistics, I think by like 82, the odds of either having cancer, some type of cancer, or cardiovascular disease, like, pick your poison basically, right? Like exponentially, I forget what the data was, but the odds are so high. And hearing you say aging, and that this is like, I think humans have been trying to live forever, right? Trying to, we go back to this fallacy of the fountain of youth, right? The old fiction, or the story, right, of finding the fountain of youth, or the Holy Grail, right? Of finding, the Holy Grail and being able to drink and living forever, is on everyone's mind. And I think I go back to what I originally said, when we start up, talking about cancer, no one talks about death, right? And so maybe this is just this topic, and I guess I speak from this from a point of, I don't think anyone's ever prepared, but I think maybe just in my experience, I've experienced a lot of death in the last 12 years of people that I've become fairly close with, and naturally losing my dad. Not that there's an acceptance of that, but life is, there's no infinite. No one lives forever, right? There's no, and we never know, right? Today could be my last day, or anyone's last day for that matter. So you have to live every day like it's your last. But on that note is, you don't go out and have like, to your point, you don't have a full bottle of wine every day just because you think today is going to be your last day, right? Everything in moderation. But I think also my point here is, like, we have, I think society as a whole in the world, we have this very hard time of dealing with death and the reality of that. And I think that's part of the equation here, possibly, why people have such a hard time with that, and then why people want to try to live as long as they can. Which some things are out of our control, right? I mean, I'm sure you've met many patients that have done all the right things, have led a healthy lifestyle, have had a healthy diet, exercise daily, and still get cancers, right? And we don't know why that happens. But eventually we all will succumb to something, and aging is a natural process. So I think, to your point, why it's so common, in terms of aging. Like I said, I go back to that statistic that I remember early on in this career, and it was so obvious to me that at some point you're either going to get cancer or heart disease based on your age, which is just the reality of what it is and where we are today.
Yeah, so I've been told that, I remember hearing on the program that Dustin Hoffman plans to have on his tombstone, I knew this was going to happen.
Yeah.
So all the things that increase the risk of cancer, also because they can damage cells and make them senescent, they also increase the risk of damage to the heart and other organs, and increase aging. So the healthier lifestyles, you reduce the risk of both of those things. But as far as living forever, I always remember a colleague who was in his 60s at the time. And he told me that it was only when he first saw his first grandchild that he realized the importance of his own mortality. That because if people didn't die, then you couldn't have grandchildren. There would not be room for everybody. So this is the importance of one's own mortality, is to make room for all the children and grandchildren, great grandchildren that you want to have. But then, so if we can't live forever, how do we do it as healthily as possible? And again, avoid the things that to the extent possible, that can cause a lot of mutations and damage, but while you're still trying to have a good time. So it's like if you go out skiing, that's exercise, so you can help prolong your life expectancy. But then if you get to an accident, break your leg, then that's a downside. So everything we do has an upside and a downside.
Correct. My last point here that I wanted to bring up on the book, and then I got two questions for you, and then we're going to share with our audience where they can learn more, get the book. But you mentioned the future of cancer care, and I'd love to talk about, in a perfect scenario, or, well, we'll bring that question up after, but where do you think the future of cancer care is, and where do we go?
Uh, so I think, no, research is happening very rapidly. So I go to 4 or 5 major meetings a year. So every 3 months, I'll go to a meeting, and there've been major new things happening since the last one. So things are happening very rapidly. And as I said, we can't predict where the next big advance is going to be, because it's just going to be something that somebody noticed, that they then test something, and it ends up working spectacularly better than what we've done before. So that the important thing is that we keep on doing research, and so this is one of the huge problems with the cost of new drugs. Governments and payers are starting to find it difficult to pay for them, and if we stop paying for them, and that decreases the profits. The profits drive investment. That investment drives progress. So we need to bring down the cost, while not bringing down the impetus to keep doing the research that is so important at driving things forward. But there'll be a number of things, like, for example, right now we might give adjuvant chemotherapy after somebody has surgery to reduce the risk of the cancer coming back. By 5 or 10 years from now, we will not be doing that anymore, because the current research indicates that if you take a blood test a month or so after the surgery, if you do not find any circulating tumor cells, then there are none, and it's highly likely that the patient is cured. If you find some, then the cancer is going to show up again in a few months or a year or two, and those are the people that need treatment. So that could change things in a major way. Trying to harness all the parts of the immune system, and not just the parts that we can currently harness. That could have huge beneficial impact. Also, the ways of designing new drugs, so that there's something called BiTEs, bispecific T-cell engagers, that are antibodies that one arm latches onto a T-cell, which is one of the immune cells. The other arm latches onto a tumor cell, brings them close together so the T cell can kill the tumor cell, and so there's a potential huge future for those things. So lots and lots and lots of different things that could make a big difference in the not too distant future. And as I said, can't predict it, because every time that we make an advance in one area, we think we've got it, now it's going to work everywhere. Like the targeted therapies, when they started working in non-small cell lung cancer and adenocarcinoma lung, and back in 1999, 2000, we thought, now this is going to work everywhere. But it doesn't work in squamous cell lung cancer or small cell lung cancer or pancreatic cancer. But at least we've made progress in one area, and so we have to then find out why it's not working there and what the other approaches are. So I can't say what it's going to look like. I can say for sure it's going to look different. Simply because when I look at the past 46 years since I went into oncology training, things are so much different now than they were back 46 years ago. And compared to 5 years ago, things are so much different now than they were 5 years ago. So I know that things are going to keep on changing rapidly as long as we keep on investing in the research. As long as we keep that investment in research, we are going to keep on making progress.
So powerful. I remember reading something recently too. We're really good at acute care, right? If you break your arm, you're having a baby, you go to a hospital, and this is pretty much in North America, well, Canada and the US, you get phenomenal care. People blow out their ACLs. You have these star athletes, these world-class athletes across the world, they have these major injuries. They're back on a soccer field, a football field, a baseball diamond, basketball court, within months, right? Which is amazing, right? Where, 10 years ago, I just know American here, like, Tommy John surgery, you blow out your rotator cuff, you were done, right? You blew out an ACL, you're done, right? Now these athletes, they come back so quickly. And I think our system has gotten really good with acute care. And, I know we beat up at, I say I've, maybe on this episode and other episodes, I'm very critical about our cancer system here in the United States, because as I said, it's frustrating, right? I went through it with my dad, and then, I've got a couple families that I go through. but we have made significant progress. And I think to your point here is we've got to keep pushing, right? And there is this balance. I know I was in the for-profit world before I started Project Purple. And, pharma is in a not, they don't do things for free, right? Like there's a risk reward, right? And there's got to be enough money in it for them to continue to do this, because they're not going to keep doing these things to fail, to lose money. But we've got to kind of keep pushing for the research and for the advances. So I think that was just such a powerful thing that you just mentioned, because I think, again, we are getting better. If you look back, things have gotten better. I think your analogy of surgery, right? Like you just look at where we are with surgery and, how better we've gotten just in our space in pancreatic cancer. The percentage of people like having major complications from a Whipple, I know over the years has gone down dramatically. Whereas, 10 years ago, people had massive complications with the Whipple surgery. Now we do them robotically. So advances are happening. I know they're not happening as fast as we want them, but we have to keep that pedal on the gas pedal to keep pushing for research and advancement and funding from all parties. I got two last questions here. And the first one, these are loaded, as I say. If you've listened to the podcast, and for those that are listening, I like these loaded questions. There's no right or wrong to either one of these questions here that I'm going to ask you. But the first one is, if you could create a perfect world in your experience, Dr. Stewart, what would be the perfect world for healthcare? If we could, and if we had to radically change everything, what it would look like, and what would you do at a very high level? I know we can go down, this could be a long answer, but at a high level, what are some things that we could do in a perfect world to change the healthcare system?
Well, of course, there is no perfect world. And so that in chapter 14 of the book, I compare the American and Canadian healthcare systems. And the American healthcare system actually does cancer care better than the Canadian system. But primary care, the Canadian system does it quite a bit better than the American system. And they're both about the same for emergencies. But this is the reason that the United States ranks 49th in the world with respect to life expectancy. They're just ahead of Albania, is because of the fact that the primary care does not work well. So young people die of things that they shouldn't be dying from. But once Americans reach the age of 65 and have Medicare, it's gold plated. And so actually cancer care is better in the United States than in Canada. It's good in Canada, but it just takes us even longer to make things happen than it does in the United States, and taking longer means that people will die that would not have to die. So I did a calculation that of the 80,000 Canadians that die every year of cancer, if Canadians had the same rapid access to cancer care as Americans, it would be 9,000 fewer cancer deaths in Canada. But even in the United States, it depends. So that the poorest Canadians do better than the poorest Americans, but the richest Americans, the richest Canadians do not do as well as the richest Americans, and it all depends on healthcare resources and how they're set up and what. How it's set up. So actually, so one of my colleagues always used to say that the perfect system was where everybody paid for things out of their own pocket, because then they would make their own decisions about what was important, and nobody could really jack up the prices because they wouldn't be able to sell anything if they really jacked up the prices. So, of course, that's no longer that's long since not being feasible because of how expensive everything is right now. But I think that different healthcare systems have gotten different things right. So there's some things that the U.S. healthcare system does well, some of the Canadian healthcare system does well, some of the U.K. or Germany or France or Switzerland, that they all do some things better than others, but as far as finding a perfect one, I know if I try to design a perfect one, that there will be something in it that will mess things up badly in one particular area. So we have to keep on working on on trying to solve the problems that we've got. So in the United States, it means trying to get affordable care to young people, so you don't have a bunch of young people dying that did not have to die because they did not have good access to primary care. In Canada, we have to do better with older people, the oldest people, making sure that they can get faster access to everything that they need.
Powerful. My last question here, and then we're going to share with our audience where they can learn more about the book, get the book. Again, this is a loaded question. There's no right or wrong, but in your professional experience, how do you define cancer? What's your definition?
How do I define cancer? Well, the pathologists define it fairly clearly because we've got different categories. But it's cells that are growing uncontrollably, so that the usual controls that make the cells in your body just divide when they're supposed to divide, those controls are gone, so that it keeps on growing when it shouldn't be, and also can spread through the bloodstream or invade into other tissues. So that's what cancer is. So there are a few other diseases that have sort of some of the same characteristics, but really aren't cancer because they don't do things that are going to be lethal, like endometriosis, for example, or some things like that. But it's cells that are growing uncontrollably, that are not dying when they're supposed to die, and are dividing when they should not divide.
Dr. Stewart, last thing here, where's the best place for our audience to connect, learn more about your book, learn more about the work you're doing? I'm not sure if that's your website, off Amazon. Let's give them that information now.
Yeah, so that the best way to buy the book is through Amazon Books, and can order either hard copy or paperback or electronic. Also, electronic is available through Barnes and Noble and a whole bunch of other people like that. My website, whycancerstillsucks.com, has a link to the different places like Amazon and all the other places that you can buy it, like the electronic version through Apple Books or even Walmart, or a place like that for the electronic version.
Awesome. Dr. Stewart, thank you for all your work you're doing in the cancer community, and thank you for being a guest on the Project Purple podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I very much appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you.
It's awesome. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Project Purple podcast. If you like what you hear today or what you viewed here on YouTube, feel free to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts, and make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for listening, and until next time, please be safe. That's a wrap of another episode of the Project Purple podcast.